I'd like to certainly thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you. And if you would be turning in your Old Testament back to the book of Genesis, chapter 37, where we're going to start. Tonight, tomorrow evening, and on the Lord's Day, we will be studying some things that I truly hope, and as William said in his prayer, that they be from the oracles of God. So in that case, I hope you don't hear a single thing new in the days to come. We want to study a little bit about what God's Word says for us. Tonight we're going to spend a lot of our time in the Old Testament looking at Joseph. Everything, I remember to push my buttons when I'm supposed to. The title of the lesson tonight, One More Coat for Joseph. Joseph is probably one of many characters that we recognize. Maybe we can even somehow relate to him, and hopefully that's what we can do tonight. What we see out of Joseph is we think about any one point in his life, and even little ones. Most likely we'll pull out the coat of many colors. It's like, hey, there's one of the coats we're going to talk about tonight. If you would, in Genesis 37, I quit talking and get to it here myself, we see that there are a few coats that are mentioned that Joseph wears in his life. And there's going to be a few things in here that hopefully we can pull out and learn from and certainly apply. Most of the verses that we're going to look at are going to be in your Bibles. There will be a few on the PowerPoint, but mostly it'll just be me pointing. Read along with me, please. Genesis chapter 37, and the first four verses. It says, Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report to them, of them, to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. He also made him a tunic, some versions say coat, of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. We see this favorite son. He is given a coat of honor, and his brothers can't stand him. Well, the brothers conspire against him. Over in verse 18, same chapter, Genesis 37, it says, Now when they saw him afar off, even before he came near, they conspired against him to kill him. And we see them mocking, Look, the dreamer cometh. And they're just making fun of this. Further in this chapter, in verse 22, just for the sake of time, doing a little skipping around here, it says, And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. Anyway, he's thrown into the pit, and of course the coat is taken off of him, and one of the downright dirtiest tricks anyone could play on somebody else, let alone it be the sons doing this to their father. In verse 23 it says, It came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into the pit, and the pit was empty, for there was no water in it. And the picture here of what they do to deceive him, over in verse 31. It says, so they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of goats, and dipped it in the tunic in the blood. And they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? It's like, don't you just want to paddle those brothers right here? Of all of the things, that is just the worst picture there ever could be on this father. Little side lesson about Jacob here is that it is possible to sincerely believe a lie. It says they all rallied around and they rose to comfort him, and he refused to be comforted. And really, the language, you follow Jacob's life, it's not until he's 147 years old and before Pharaoh and about to bless Ephraim and Manasseh that Jacob finally says something positive. You look at most of the quotes of Jacob from here on, they are negative. Even when he learns that Joseph is still alive, and we'll get back around to that in a minute, he says, now I can die. It's like, wait, there you get there, yeah, you just, step it up there. When Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? His family's delivered from the famine. And he tells him, 130, and few and full of trouble have been the days of my pilgrimages, and they have not exceeded the days of my forefathers. You just hear Pharaoh going, glad to meet you. Okay. This affects the rest of his life. And of course, our focus is on Joseph here. So what we see about Joseph is with his brothers, he's given this coat in front of his brothers. First of all, just as we see this, just to summarize quickly, he serves faithfully, he becomes favored. He's given a coat of many colors. He is betrayed by his brothers, thrown in the pit, sold to the Midianites that are heading to Egypt, and the coat was used to deceive his father. And so there's the first coat. Now these other coats you know about, but if you're like me, before I'd ever necessarily started looking at what he was wearing, I haven't thought about the rest of the things that unfold that are a couple more coats that are talked about in his life. The next one that we see is in Egypt. Turn over to Genesis chapter 39. When Joseph finds himself in Egypt, once again, we start in verse 1 of chapter 39. It says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found favor in his sight, and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had was put under his authority. Now, we see this honor that is with him. It doesn't take people long to recognize God's with Joseph. And Potiphar, I think, is one of the brightest people that we see in the entire narrative of Joseph. He sees this fellow is good for his house. Verse 4, it says, so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. And he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. And so it was from that time that he had made him an overseer of the house, and all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and did not know what he had except for the bread that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And we know the rest. That's a little lead-in for the next little piece of history that walks into Joseph's life, isn't it? We wind up seeing from verse 7 down through about verse 18 here that Joseph is propositioned by Potiphar's wife. So it came to pass in these things, his master's wife cast longing eyes at Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But she refused. But he refused, and it said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in the house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. Now how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And we see that a good man in a wicked world has sin walking up to him. She is persistent, and this continues on. It says in verse 10, "So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment." Okay. Here's the next quote. "Caught him by the garment and said, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, she fled outside. And she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, 'See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He's come to lie with me.' And I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until her master came home. Then he spoke to him the words like these, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came to me to mock me.' And so what happened? I lifted up my voice and cried out and left his garment and fled outside." And of course, there she stands with his coat. And we see the next coat that is talked about in his life. What do we see? Symbolically, the wealth and prosperity that Potiphar has. It's because, here we go again, he serves faithfully, it becomes favored, he is given this coat of honor. It's not called that, but we see him wearing a coat, so we're going to call it that. Betrayed by Potiphar's wife, thrown into the king's prison because of this. And once again, the coat is used to deceive. That this wicked woman, not wanting to be shamed, throws the shame on him and puts Potiphar in the position of losing his right-hand man. And once again, by no doing of his own, we wind up seeing the second coat that he puts on. The drama unfolds a little bit more. Of course, we know that in prison, we wind up seeing Joseph once again rise to prominence. Over in chapter 41, we see the trail that winds up leading, of course, to Pharaoh. Skipping over chapter 40, the incidents that are happening in the king's prison wind up, once again, those in charge of the prison wind up putting Joseph in charge of the prison as well. He interprets these dreams, and of course, the butler and the baker. Butler, baker, and the candlestick maker. No candlestick maker. He tells the butler, "It's not going to be long till you are back with Pharaoh." He tells the baker says, "Oh yeah, interpret mine." He says, "A couple of days you're going to be hanged." There's one little thing that we see happens. He asks the butler, the cupbearer as he's referred to remember him before Pharaoh. And So time passes. That's where we see chapter 41. It says, then it came to pass at the end of 2 years. So interpret these dreams for these fellows. One of them turns out well, and he's going right back to be literally an arm's length of Pharaoh. And it's not for 2 years then. He sets in prison for 2 more years. It says, after the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. And the picture here, the personification that we see of the fat and the skinny coming out here. It says, and suddenly there came out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow, and behold, 7 other cows came, and after them went out of the river ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. Now, I have to tell you, from my littlest Sunday school class memories, and walking around Grandpa's farm in Kentucky, I've never seen cows eat each other, fat or skinny. So it's like this stuck in my mind, and I'll have to say, when I'm walking by, I'm kind of watching the cows. Of course, the picture here is he woke up, and again, it winds up being the heads of grain, the same way. And of course, we know that this is the dream that Pharaoh has about the upcoming famine, the 7 years of plenty, followed by the 7 years of famine. Well, verse 8, it says, now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit, talking about Pharaoh, it says his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Notice verse 9. It says, then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, oh, I remember my faults this day. After 2 years, this guy goes, oh, there was something I was supposed to tell you. It's about Joseph. And basically, Pharaoh says, well, get him in here. And we see these dreams interpreted down in verse 14. The Pharaoh sent and called Joseph and brought him quickly out of the dungeon. Notice the rest of that verse. It says, and he changed his clothes, and came to Pharaoh. We wind up seeing, here's the garments showing up again. Down, of course, Joseph interprets this dream for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is astounded, is impressed with Joseph, of course. Chapter 41 and verse 41, it says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Now this is jumping ahead. Joseph's got the ideas for how to take care of this and how to implement it. And Pharaoh says, you're the man for the job. Not only have you got the ideas, you're going to be the one I'm going to put in charge of it. And so it says, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took off the signet off of his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And we see Joseph become second only to Pharaoh, delivers this nation from the famine, sets up the storehouses and imposes the taxes, the gathering during the years of plenty, so that they will have more than they need in the years of famine to come. We know why that turns out the way that it does. Let's just read a couple more verses here. Verse 45. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man can lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name. Anybody looking for kids' names? Here you go. Zephnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, and Joseph went out all over the land of Egypt. Next verse says that Joseph was 30 here. The picture that we have unfolding before us is finally the coat that not only delivers Joseph, but it's going to deliver his family as well. So we have this progression. We find him in prison because of the last one, and then before Pharaoh. And just to summarize this, what's he do? He serves faithfully and becomes favored. He is forgotten by Pharaoh's cupbearer and has to sit there for 2 more years. He interprets the dreams and is put in charge of everything in Egypt. This time, instead of the coat as a symbol of deception, it is seen as a coat of deliverance. When we think about this last coat, what do we see but the fact that he could have never worn those garments of honor at the end if he hadn't gone through everything else? There's no way that the 11th son of a sheep herder would wind up being basically the prime minister of Egypt unless he had gone through everything else that was there. The picture of the last coat. And so often when we think about experiences, do we stack them up? Do we stack them up like Joseph does? Now you think about the things that this guy has gone through. He was a favored child, and then he was basically an abducted child. 17, he's sold off, separated from his family, from his father that loved him, and those brothers, whether they could stand him or not, they're gone. Would we be bitter? Would we be saying, I had a tough childhood, that way, therefore I can be, I can make the papers and all the police blotters anytime I want. It's my excuse. Joseph could have. Somebody who want to explain behavior because of tough childhood. There's one. There's a tragedy. Getting the shaft, as far as company dried up and left town and left me without a job. Therefore, I can be miserable to anybody. Certainly don't wish anything ill on somebody else. Not only did his employment dry up, he was falsely accused and terminated and imprisoned wrongfully. I doubt that even the best of times, the king's prison was probably not color TV and carpet. Winds up with a degree when he gets out. Just got a feeling that's not the picture in any kind of prison, like it or not, whether he's favored or not. And we see him faithful to God, and God blesses him. Well, Genesis chapter 41 and verse 41 and 42, just to see this garment that we see him wearing here. Pharaoh, verse 42, Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him with the garments of fine linen and a gold chain put around his neck. This time it's used to deliver. We went past this, right? No, we did. Oh, okay. It's only a slight heart palpitation there when the slide doesn't come up. Don't preach with it until you can preach without it. That's always the rule, right? Joseph literally makes the best of each coat. And what we see is really the summary of the first two coats. Even though that first one was a coat of many colors, things don't turn out well in the direction that coat really takes him. James chapter 1, and obviously a verse that applies to us. It says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces bitterness." It produces skepticism, produces complaining about everything in life. James says, our patience is going to be tried. It's not if, it's when. It says, "But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." Let me ask the question. Which coat are we wearing? And when we look at him as stages in his life, one was the teenager, up to being a teenager. The next one is him up to 30. And then, of course, we see the picture of him coming on up of age and in charge of so much in an age of responsibility, and then ultimately delivering his family. Now, talking about family, anybody have family? Anybody have one of those families? Oh yeah, no. Think about Joseph's family. All right, there are people who don't necessarily know his history, where he is. What has he done but lived a long time needing to try to live it down? Look in Genesis chapter 41. This is one of those passages that comes along under the heading of, if you ever want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. Notice in verse 51, it says, "And Joseph called the name of the firstborn," talking about his boys, "called him Manasseh." And we have the meaning of the names right here. It says, "For God made me forget all my toil in all my father's house." This is what, son, this is what you're named. And this is what it means. God has made me forget all the toil in my father's house. Look at what Ephraim is named. Verse 52, "And the name of the second is called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction." So do we see what is really the meanings of his two boys' names are? God's let me get past my past. And the second boy, God has caused me to get on with my life and make the best of where I am. That's, you can just see he's a bigwig now. Everything's much better than it was in prison. He's got that coat of responsibility and the signet ring, and he's in charge. And he's got children born to him now, and he names them. I'm through looking back at what the pain my family caused, and I'm making the most of where I am. That's what he names his boys. What is the very next thing that happens in the story of Joseph? Knock, knock. "Hi, we're the sons of Jacob. There's a famine back in Canaan, and we've come here to buy food." The very next thing that happens is the scene shifts back to Jacob telling his boys, "What you looking around at each other for? Go get the food and eat." That kind of is. Why do you look at one another? Is what he tells them. Don't just stand there. Do something. That's that pessimistic old Jacob. You won't find a good word out of his mouth until the end of his life. Just as sure as he's thinking, I finally got the coat on, that I can get on with it and be fine, he's got to deal with his brothers walking back in the door. What does he do with them after the test? And after they're scared to death, they're thinking, okay, we're going to get rubbed out here. He tells them, don't be afraid, for it's God that caused this to happen. We see this being exactly what happens in this delivery. So when we see him say, for God has made me forget my toil in all my father's house, and for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction, doesn't that remind you of what the Apostle Paul says about his condition? We could talk about different coats of Saul, who became the Apostle Paul. Like he had not only did he have the tenure at the school of Gamaliel, his university day job, parking place out front with his name on it, all the benefits, whatever they would have been. He says in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 7, "But what things were gained to me, these I have counted loss for Christ. Yet indeed I also count all things lost for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and counted them rubbish, that I may gain Christ." I always focus on a couple different ways that the Apostle Paul says that here. He says, "I've counted it loss for Christ." But do you recall what happened on some of his first return trips back to Jerusalem? They wanted to kill him. He also suffered the loss of all things. The things that he had set aside for his own faith, for his own faithfulness to Christ, and trying to preach to his own countrymen, he winds up being rejected by them and losing his parking place out front of the school of Gamaliel. Counted it as rubbish that he may gain Christ. Well, what coat are we wearing? One of the things that we have to apply from this, that Joseph would have wound up feeling as well. You know what? We don't know if this is the last coat or what the next coat is going to be. What's the next stage in our life going to show? What's the next stage in our life going to bring upon us? Good? Bad? Being favored? Being deceived? One of the things that we learned is, and I remember I think it was a slam dunk contest during the All-Star basketball game. Usually that's where I wake up on Sunday afternoon and watch the slam dunk contest during the finals, or during the All-Star game. There was a sign somebody had made for one of the guys that was out there. And it wasn't Michael Jordan. It was just after him. I can't remember who it was. But there was a sign that they put up, and it said, "It ain't the shoes." And it's like, you know about all the endorsements, these professional millionaires. It's all, whose shoes you're wearing and this and that, and guys are out there pumping the big fat tongues on their Reebok shoes to air them up, and of course, Michael Jordan's, Air Jordans and all those kind of things. Somebody held up a sign that said, "It ain't shoes." Think about that with Joseph. The coat didn't make the man. When we see Joseph, we see him with the same attitude, the same idea that's applied, whether it was in his father's house, with his brothers. He was supposed to report back to his dad about his brothers, and they weren't where they were supposed to be. So there is some honesty and loyalty about him that his brothers don't like. We find him honest and blessed by God in Potiphar's house. And when directly approached and confronted with sin, he realizes that not only is he before the human beings that he is responsible to, he says, how can I do this and sin against God? He tells Pharaoh, this is what God's going to do. He tells his brothers, essentially, it's not your fault. God sent me here. Now we think about giving God credit, what, for him being an abducted child, for him being lied to, being tempted by Potiphar's wife, being proposition. It's like, gotta be careful how much of everything we give God the credit or the blame for. But what we see is this faithful man decided to be faithful to God no matter what coat he was wearing. A lot of verses we could turn to talking about our endurance, our steadfastness, our faithfulness. So many passages that say, if you hold fast. The condition that we have on our salvation winds up being one of being faithful to death. I'll give you kind of like Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10 at the end of it. But if you would turn over to the book of Revelation in chapter 7. Because we're going to talk about one more coat. Garments are something that are talked about really, and we could apply them all the way through the scriptures. When Jesus is talking about when the bridegroom comes, there are those who are wearing the garments and those who are not. One of the things that we see, and the picture of heaven itself, is that the last coat, the last garments being talked about are for those that are delivered. Turn to Revelation 7. The scene that unfolds in heaven, and I always talk about the throne scene, 5 and 6 and so on, that it's like a concert footage and different things. Around the first of the year, there's always the big monster jam that shows up in Toronto. We took the boys a couple years ago. But what do they do on the commercials for all of that? There's some guy talking, all big and funny, and they show you pictures, and they show you a loaded crowd in a stadium, and people are going crazy, and you're thinking, oh, I gotta be part of that. What do we see God do but show us in the throne scene all of the heavenly hosts and all of those angels and all of those who are slain and everyone gathered around singing and praising God? It's like the concert in the Monster Jam commercial. It's done so that we say, oh, I want to be a part of that. Where do I get tickets for that? Look with me in chapter 7, verse 9. It says, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations and tribes and people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes and palm branches in their hand. And the description, of course, goes on. But did you catch what's going on there? They are clothed in the white robes. It is the symbol of purity that's throughout Revelation. When those in Laodicea are told to buy those white garments from the Lord because they're black, shiny ones that they were known for, that's not the picture of God's purity. Chapter 7, verse 13 says, then one of the elders answered, saying to me, who are these arrayed in white robes, and where did they come from? And I said to him, sir, you know. So he said to me, these are the ones who came out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. They shall neither hunger any more nor thirst any more, and the sun shall not strike them nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of water. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. What do we see that's one of the most appealing things there could ever be about that last garment is no more tears. Anybody here tear-free? Hard, right? This life is full of tears. And every coat of Joseph's, in one way or another, came with tears. When he couldn't hold it back any longer, when he was in charge of everything, what did he do? He wept so loud and told him, I am Joseph, that his aides wondered what was going on. Every coat, in one way or another in this life, is going to have its tears. Not the last one. One of the things that we see from Joseph is no matter what this life hands us, we have examples written aforetime for our learning. That regardless of what this life hands us, in spite of what this life hands us, may we be faithful to him, no matter what. Tonight we haven't talked about how we get those tickets to gather around the throne, to wear those white robes to redeem. But as we always do, there is the appeal that if you are not a child of God, if you are not a Christian, and you do know what you need to do to become one, maybe you putting it up, there is a coat to wear. Being a Christian is talked about like a garment as well, isn't it? That we put on Christ. There's a conscious decision that we have to make to decide this is a coat I want to wear. What do we see? But if we have been baptized for the remission of our sins and raised to walk in newness of life, we have put off that old man. He's left dead in the water. Raised to walk in newness of life, forgiveness of our sins, and to live faithful to death. One of these days we might just be able to ask Joseph, what was it like in that pit? I was thinking when I was little, did those cows really eat those other cows? May we always persevere to be faithful no matter what. We have an invitation song tonight, number 336. Conclusion and invitation. If you are in need of the gospel, brethren here would be so happy to help you in any way that they can. Let it be known right now while we stand and sing.